Good morning, everybody. My name is László Brust. I'm the co-director of the CEU Democracy Institute. Welcome, everybody, to this event of today as a discussion on the conference on the future of Europe with the subtitle Democratic Innovation or Business as Usual. This event is co-organized by the CEU Democracy Institute and the Review of Democracy, the online platform of debate on democracy in Europe and elsewhere. With this event, we celebrate two things. One is the long-awaited starting of the conference on the future of Europe that started yesterday. And that was described in a recent piece in Politico as the following way, that this exercise designed to go nowhere could drive change if ordinary citizens mobilize. That's the question also that hopefully the participants are going to discuss. But we also celebrate today the launch of the Review of Democracy, the online platform of the Democracy Institute for discussion, debate on the future of democracy, not only in Europe, but also globally. Thanks a lot for you. Without much ado, I pass over the word to Alberto Alemanno, who will moderate this discussion. The floor is yours, Alberto.
Thank you, László, and welcome to our RevDem webinar devoted to the Conference on the Future of Europe. My name is Alberto Alemanno. I'm a professor of European law at HEC Paris and head of section at the brand new Review of Democracy, where I'm responsible for democratic renewal. Today, I'll have the pleasure to moderate the debate among some stellar speakers who probably don't need an introduction to most of you in our audience. I do that anyway. Let me start with Professor Giuliano Amato, former Prime Minister of Italy, current member of the Italian Constitutional Court, and even more relevant for today's discussion, Professor Amato served as Vice President of the Convention on the Future of Europe that drafted the European Constitutional Treaty back in 2003. We then have Dr. Toon Nguyen, a Policy Fellow for European Institutions and Democracy at the Jacques Delors Center at the Emeritus School in Berlin. Ulrike Guérot, Professor of European Policy and Study of Democracy at Danube University and founder of European Democracy Lab, one of the leading voices on the democratization of the EU. Last but not least, Hélène Landemort, Associate Professor of Political Science at Yale University, a political theorist who has been deeply involved in theorizing and observing democratic innovations across continent. Before turning to our speakers, let me do some housekeeping in the most participatory spirit. Each of you following us through various social channels will have the chance to ask questions all along the event. You can pose your questions both under the Facebook video as well as under the Twitter spot. Some moderation will occur there, and some of these questions will be picked and put to our in the most participatory spirit, each of you following us. Let me now to briefly set the scene by highlighting some of the features of the Conference on the Future of Europe. This was officially launched yesterday on Europe's Day in Strasbourg, and it is now officially up and running, at least for the next 8 months, the new duration or expiration time for this self-proclaimed democratic exercise. Let me start by saying that this Conference on the Future of Europe, regardless of what you think or perceive about it, is somehow the first time since 2007 that the European Union embarks on a process of potential institutional reform. And to do so at these unprecedented geopolitical times, both internal and external to the Union, might appear counterintuitive to many and is per se quite remarkable. It is actually happening, although with 1 year delay. The conference differs greatly from the previous 2003 Convention on the Future of Europe, which drafted the European never ratified constitutional treaty. The new conference is not set to directly prepare treaty changes. We are not acting within Article 48 of the Treaty on the European Union. Rather, is meant to be a preparatory process that could lead the European Council to initiate them. Unlike that conference, this initiative is supposed to be, beginning of the quote, a bottom-up exercise where European citizens are listened to and their voices contribute to the debates on the future of Europe, end of the quote. To guarantee this outcome, the Conference on the Future of Europe has been designed as the first ever European-wide public consultation exercise jointly organized by its three major institutions and entailing a pyramidal structure organized upon 3 steps or 3 levels. At the bottom of the pyramid, there is a transnational platform open to anyone willing to share ideas, organize, or attend event, and define through an AI moderated system the agenda of the next 2 levels for the conference. The second level entails, for the first time again, the creation of a transnational and local citizens' assembly made of randomly selected citizens debating inter alia some of the issues previously defined through the platform, but open to other issues that the citizens themselves, the participants to those assemblies, will be able to identify. The third and last level it really occurs on the top of the pyramid. And this will be a plenary made of 433 members, mixing EU and nationally elected representatives and citizens from the panels themselves, as well as social partners and possibly organized civil society. This will be tasked to review, deliberate, and wrap up some recommendations, and de facto acting as a potential constituent actor in the overall Conference on the Future of Europe. Let me highlight that none of these mechanisms has ever been tried before, certainly not at this scale. Most observers have been dismissed the Conference on the Future of Europe as a top-down exercise with a strong pro-European bias that will struggle to deliver on its promises, and even warn that it might even backfire by raising impossible expectations. Without wanting to preempt our conversation, I was asked to potentially share my own take on this before getting started in order to provoke some reactions also from the panelists in the course of the next few minutes. I'm slightly more optimistic than most observers. As you might have seen, there are a lot of unprecedented features characterizing this process of reflection on Europe. I see value in this unprecedented nature of the democratic exercise because it's really about collecting self-reflection happening at the transnational level, which is set to generate an equally unprecedented set of ideas and dynamics that I think will be very difficult to be put back into the battle. The genius will be out, and some of these ideas will stay with us for some time. I spoke way too much, but I thought that it was important to set somehow the frame in which this Conference on the Future of Europe has just started before turning to our guest. Without any further ado, Professor Amato, I turn to you. Thank you for being with us today. As a former member of the European Council, where you have sat twice as an Italian Prime Minister, but also as a constitutional law professor and an experienced and refined observer of European integration, what is your take on this Conference on the Future of Europe? In particular, what are your reflections on the nature of this exercise as compared to the one you have been directly involved, and what learning, if any, could be shared today? To you, Professor Amato.
Well, thank you for inviting me and for giving me the floor now. I have to apologize since the beginning because, as you know, I will have to leave at 11 because my court is in session, and at 11 I will have to go to the works of the court. Well, I can tell you briefly, now I'm more optimistic than I was when the conference was launched initially in 2019. And I was a little bit skeptical, perhaps for opposite reasons. Not because I saw it as a top-down exercise, but because my first reaction was, we have so many issues to solve in Europe today. to get the positions of the citizens, to get their support or their disagreement on several matters upon which the union is nowadays sort of paralyzed by dissents, different positions, etc. It's not a solution. Opening up a conference just to listen to the citizens, any opinion is welcome, hundreds of ideas will arrive. And at the end, what will the institutions and the political leaders do with all these ideas? It might be a wonderful exercise in not a deliberative democracy, but sort of a wonderful survey, just to catch the feelings and the proposals of the citizens, but what at the end of the exercise? This was my initial objection, and I must say that little by little in 2 years, the conference has been taking a structure and a shape. Mm-hmm. And this makes me more confident now, because we will have, I don't want to be misunderstood. I have nothing against listen to the voice of the people and of the citizens, but I don't want their voices to fade away in the air, because nobody eventually sums up what has to come out of it. We have recent examples. Think of Ireland, and think of the new legislation on abortion. Probably it would have never come out of debates inside the parliament and the institutions. It was the popular voice that brought to the eventual decision of the institutions. I don't enter into the substance whether it was a right or a wrong decision, but it came out of a bottom-up process. So, I mean, this is wonderful, but there has to be somebody on the other side organizing all of these voices, all of these opinions, and summing up conclusions, summing up the decision of the 3 institutions of a few months ago, the concrete recommendations for the union. This is an essential gear because at the end, these voices should not fade away, but should generate concrete recommendations. You have already described the structure of the conference. There will be a plenary, there will be an executive board, there will be the presidency. The presidency is a little bit Bosnia-Herzegovina. The 3 ethnic groups who didn't find the courage to give the presidency to one of them. So my initial reaction, oh, Sarajevo again, I love Sarajevo, but anyhow, they will manage. Now, the point already is what specific recommendations to do what? What happens if these specific recommendations lead to necessary modifications of the treaty in order to enforce the recommendations themselves? You know that there is a sharp division, and the debate about the possible outcome of the conference in this last couple of years was precisely on this point. no modifications of the treaty, specific recommendations, whatever you want, but within the existing legal framework of the Union. And we have a very recent document undersigned by 12 of our member states, not our big brothers, smaller brothers, but 12 small brothers means something in the European Union, and perhaps their voice reflects an opinion which is not only their opinion, but also of others. So the division is still there. So what will happen from this angle? And this is my point that I made, if I may quote myself, in a paper that I wrote a couple of years ago, the title of which was From the Years of the Convention to the Years of Brexit, something like that, that was published in a collective volume, hard publishing, that was, now I tell you, The Rise and Fall of the European Constitution, published 2 years ago. And in that paper, article, whatever it was, I said that I would not convene a convention, because a convention, according to the existing treaty, is by definition now, by legal definition, part of the process of treaty amendment. It was not so when my convention was convened more than 20 years ago, but it would be so after the Treaty of Lisbon. Now, due to the existing divergences on the need or not to change the treaty, I am very happy that what has been convened is not a convention, but a conference. Because a convention would immediately start with these big issues. Shall we change the treaty? Shall we go to the two-speed Europe? Shall we federalize or not federalize? Wonderful, big issues, very divisive, upon which the convention would remain divided for weeks and months, and nothing would come out of it. Let us start the other way around. This was my suggestion in that paper. Let us start from the issues we have to solve. How much of Europe is needed to face immigration? How much of Europe is needed after the pandemics in the area of health? This is something almost incredible. When we listed the competencies of the Union, you remember, so it is in the Lisbon Treaty, health is part of the third category, the complementary competencies, where the Union intervenes only to promote or support what the member states do. The demand has been in these last months for the Union to step in with decisions, deciding how many vaccines we need, how to distribute them, which rules have to be adopted for travels from one country to another, etc., etc. Anyhow, it's just an example. The point is, a conference should not immediately discuss the big divisive issues that I mentioned before, should discuss actual, concrete, and substantive items. And here you have the advantage of the bottom-up. If it's really bottom-up, let me be very sincere. In this kind of exercise, lobbyists of very honest people and citizens who have always been around the European institutions will enter and will express their views, and probably their views will be on the main issues of the organization of the institutions, federal, not federal, two-speed, one-speed, multiple clusters, etc., etc. I rely more on the other citizens, those who are less familiar with the European institutions and their usual quarrels, just to tell us what they expect the European Union to do for the future, whether the Mediterranean should be guarded by Italy and Greece, or should have a European kind of force that guarantees for everybody, whether the level of social protection in a continent that is so proud of its welfare should have a minimum standard guaranteed by the European Union itself, and not only abandoned to the resources of each member state. Whether they feel represented only as European citizens, or if they want also to be represented as national citizens, and therefore which role they expect their member states to exercise, which responsibilities they expect their member states to exercise in relation to this or to that. I make it short. When these issues, and substantially the list that we find in the institution of in the decision of the three institutions is more or less exhaustive. Environment, security, immigration, financial matters, social protection, etc., etc. If the conference succeeds in giving a clear understanding to this or to that, this is the solution for immigration that we prefer. This is the solution for security that we prefer. This is what we expect in terms of climate change, fighting against climate change, etc. This is the outcome. And upon this outcome, if modifications of the treaty will be necessary, this will be just executing the will of the people, let me say so, not deciding whether modifications of the treaty are useful or not as an abstract kind of dilemma. No. This is something that can be done within the existing framework. Okay, let's do it. This is something that we want with the same intensity, giving it the same importance, but it requires a couple of modifications of the treaty. They have to be done, but it's just execution. It's not a decision in principle, which in my view is a nonsense, because we used to say in Europe that we have a toolbox. Now, modifying the treaty is one of the tools. It's not something superior that cannot be touched unless, etc. If necessary, if the citizens will have decided that it's necessary. A final word that, in my view, is very much important is I hope that the conference will make it clear to all of us that extreme ideological positions on the respective roles of the Union and of the member states are out of order and should not be given sort of primacy. It should be clear. It has always been clear that our European construction has two components, the European institutions and the member states. Like it or not, they have to define their respective roles, accepting the role of the other. If there is something that each of us can't do on an individual basis, here a competence of the European institutions is the best solution, much more than intergovernmental methodologies. But we also exist as member states, and the European Union cannot regulate our lives with the uniformity, with uniform rules going beyond the sense, the usefulness, the richness of national identities and national diversities. So our problem is how to promote cooperation among our member states more than dissent, competition, and hostility. These not abolish national diversities. Let me say, and I conclude, that Altiero Spinelli, who is mostly in my country, but not only, all over Europe, the great figure of European federalism, had always written that there are some areas as to which the European institutions have to be competent and responsible. But for everything else, the states should remain free as they are to adopt their policies and their positions. So I hope that this won't be let's say, again, the conflict inside the conference. All of the members of it have to accept something that has always been clear. If you ask for democracy in Europe, your citizens will answer, I want to be represented and to have a voice in the European institutions, both as a European citizen and as an Italian, a Hungarian, a German, a French, etc. Finding the balance between these two things is not impossible at all. It is part of the solution. And I stop it here.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you for sharing so many ideas, and in particular in highlighting the fact that the actual design of the Conference on the Future of Europe represents a major learning from previous experience, is a different experience, is a preparatory process that really flip the perspective, putting the issue at the center, and only when citizens might find the need for further integration, this might actually occur. So this is a paradigmatic change in the design and in the process that has just started. I'm turning to you, Professor Landemort. Hélène, you are an attentive democratic theorist who has been writing extensively on many of the issues we are discussing today. what do you make of the Conference of the Future of Europe? How experimental can it be? In particular, to what extent its current institutional design matches your own paradigm of open democracy? Hélène.
Thank you for inviting me. So I actually accepted in part to learn about the Conference for the Future of Europe. So I'm not that familiar with the design, in part because I find it hard to gather information just browsing online. But I did look at the website. I try to inform myself as much as I could. And I have to say, it comes really late, almost in a way. This is something that should have been done 30 years ago. The European Union would be in a very different shape if we had started there instead of, finally doing something after we had to go through Brexit. So, I mean, better late than never, you might say. I think this is a great development. And it beats surveys, and it beats just asking people for their opinion in elections once in a while. So it's definitely a major improvement that way. I think the spirit is right. It's late because, the trend for participatory constitution making started in the 80s, and now we're in 2021, and we've had all these treaties that were decided on, written, put to referenda without this prior sort of like really deliberative consultations or efforts to reach out to the public. So I think it's good. It's time. It's a right move. Now, does it really meet the criteria of what I call open democracy? I reserve judgment because I don't really understand the whole design fully. I understand the intention to create a bottom-up process, which is again an excellent idea. But open democracy, it's as you talked about a paradigm shift. Open democracy for me, it really is a paradigm shift. It's a Copernican revolution. We want to create institutions that center ordinary citizens rather than elected elites. Oops, sorry, I'm losing my hearing. And I don't see that happening in this process. I see very much the existing institutions being in charge and sort of like controlling the process and not letting go of much control. That's my worry. That where is the promise of commitment ex ante? It doesn't seem to be very committal. Where is the transparency about the ways this will be processed and synthesized? Where is even the transparency about the rationale behind this particular design? I struggled to find an argument as to why we start, for example, with the collection of opinions online. To me, it's a strange choice because you're going to start with an agenda basically set by self-selected people, meaning people who have the time to go online and fill in that really long form that I had to fill in just to be able to register. And there are people who actually will know about the Conference for the Future of Europe. So, they might be part of associations, they might be engaged in this, not so much as citizens, as representatives of interest groups of various kinds. So I'm really curious about who is going to really participate at that level and why they're the one that we want to let define the agenda for the randomly selected assemblies, if you want, the panels of citizens. My own preference is for placing autocratic representatives, citizens selected at random, in this position of agenda setter, because I think through the random selection process, especially if it's paired with incentivizing moves like paying participants, then you get a much more diverse and much more descriptively representative sample than you get through self-selection. So opening a website is really nice, but you're not really making sure you get the people who should be there to decide, the people who are frustrated with Europe. And the experience of the Great National Debate, which I understand has inspired the design, is very telling actually on this. When you look at the socio-demographic compositions of who participated in the Great National Debate, it's mostly people who are the opposite profile of the Yellow Vests, because of whom the Great National Debate was started. So the only place where they were actually Yellow Vest types were in the citizens' assemblies, the regional ones that were randomly selected. There you had people showing up with a Yellow Vest, actually. So how do we make sure that the people who are tempted, who would vote for Grexit or Frexit or, are in this consultation? So we hear the frustration, we hear why they're fed up with Europe, why they want to change it or potentially exit it. I'm not sure starting with an online platform was the right way. So I'm worried about that design principle, and I didn't see any justification for it. So another thing that I noticed on the platform is that, again, maybe I didn't spend enough time on it, but doesn't strike me as very deliberative. You can enter your idea and then read other people's ideas, but can you really engage with other people? Do you have a space to talk to other people, form your opinion, exchange ideas, etc.? I don't see it. Same thing that happened during the Great National Debate, where the online platform was just basically a Q&A, sort of like questionnaire, a quiz you could answer. That doesn't match the principle of deliberation that's central to my vision for an open democracy, if you will. So, okay, so these are some things I already noticed that worry me. That said, I love the idea of, these citizen panels. So I didn't quite understand if they were just at the national level or transnational, or if they were mixing. Could you actually clarify that, since it would save me?
Well, the information is very limited, Hélène. It seems there will be 4 European citizens panel. That means transnational. And in addition to that, there will be national and local transnational. And participants coming from both the transnational and the national, some of them will be represented into the plenary session. That's what we have learned on Friday, because the deal was struck only on Friday, so on the eve of the launch of the conference.
Okay, and if I understand correctly, each of these panels will include 100 randomly selected people. Is that correct? Okay, so it's okay. So that's exactly the model of the French regional assemblies, which had around 100 people. In the end, very few of them had actually 100 people. It was closer to 80, sometimes 30. So you have to realize that your sample there will also not be likely very representative. It would have been better to have much larger, aim for larger bodies probably. Then again, I realize the costs and the facilitation, all that increases. Are these people paid to participate? Is there an honorarium to motivate people to join? Do we know that? I
think it's a question mark, which hasn't been tackled yet.
Because if there is not, it's a huge flaw in the design. I mean, we know that. We've known this for 30 years. You cannot expect people to take time out of their extremely busy lives in these, times of pandemic and being overburdened by all kinds of tasks. So I just hope that, I'm sure there are lots of really talented people who know about these things, but it's really striking to me how much of the old thinking seems to have still seeped in this approach. And so my worry is that it's just, there's a huge risk that if you're doing participation just for show and just to get people to vent, it's perhaps something. That's what the Great National Debate was to some degree. It was an occasion for people to vent. Initially, a lot of anger, flowed on the online platform, in the grievance books. And then after a while, more constructive things emerged. So maybe this European sort of consultation can perform this dual task of allowing people for a sort of cathartic moment of like rage and self-expression, and then past that go on to say, oh well, actually we could do this, we could do that, and talk to each other and let some ideas percolate to the top. So there were 2 phases, I think, to this participatory trend in the constitution making space since the 80s. The early phase was about consulting for the sake of consulting, just kind of like for show, to gain legitimacy, to say, look, this is your constitution, we've listened to you. But then there was no actual listening going on. So paradigmatic example of that was the South African participatory constitutional process of the late 1980s, I think, where there were 2 million submissions that were sent by regular mail, actually, at the time. They ended up in the basement, of the places where the parties were meeting and reaching all kinds of agreements. They were not, the letters from all these people were not read. Why? Because all that mattered is that we had the validation of popular legitimacy, right? Later, I think the trend shifted because there's this like literature on collective intelligence that shows you that the more you consult, the more you include perspectives, cognitive diversity and all that, the better the outcomes. So now there was a reason to actually read the remarks and suggestions and try to patch them together in a way that was constructive and enriching for the policymaking process. So I think we're there now. And I wonder, we're there in the participatory circles that I'm familiar with. And I think that's in some of the examples that I've looked at, for example, in Iceland. In Iceland, so there was a participatory constitutional process between 2010 and 13, where they listened to the people by having first a randomly selected group of 950 citizens. So, you know, Iceland has 325,000 people and they still got a sample of 950 people, not 100. And they asked them to come up with an agenda for the nation, for the content of their constitution. Then the Constitutional Council listened to that, including their suggestions, and then crowdsourced the draft to the rest of the population over a couple of weeks, 12 weeks in total, I think. So they had, you know, iterative input, iterative exchanges with the population. Then the draft was put to a referendum, 2/3 of the voters approved of it, and then Parliament proceeded to ignore it. But the reality is that if Parliament hadn't ignored it, we had there a constitution that was really built on the input of the public, or at least a very somewhat representative sample of it. So the ideas were extremely, at the same time, really commonsensical and bold in some cases. For example, Article 34 was all about making national property, natural resources that were not already owned, things like that. So it was just an example of where participation mattered, and it made a difference that you could actually measure. So a political scientist named Alexander Hudson actually measured that 10% of the input from the crowdsourcing phase made a textual difference to the text. So I can give you one example that I have in mind, which is the right to internet. The right to internet came from a Facebook post and was integrated in the body of the Constitution. So when you have this kind of example, which granted didn't work because Parliament decided not to, you know, implement it, but it's a process that really was neat and designed for inclusion and meaningfulness of the, you know, taking into account of the input. Then you look at the Conference for the Future of Europe and you're like, well, what's the standard of success here? What are the ways that people can actually make a difference to the policy making process down the road? Seems like the chain of causality seems a lot more diffuse and vague and kind of lost in the clouds. So I'm worried about that. In terms of the assessment as well, like, is there an independent group or association who is going to conduct an evaluation of the process? In the French case, there wasn't. So there was, you know, neither for the Great National Debate nor for the Convention for Climate. So that's a worry too, because you need to have a guarantee that protocol will be followed and that an impartial observer can sort of evaluate that down the line. I think it puts pressure on the process from the get-go to really meet, you know, demanding standards. So what was interesting in the French process that actually that might be replicated in the Convention for Climate is that at the very end there was an 8th session that the government granted the citizens, and just to ask them, okay, to give them an opportunity to answer the government and say, what do you think of the way we took into account your proposals? You know, the 149 proposals about ways to curb greenhouse gas emissions, you know, by 40% of the 90s levels in the spirit of social justice by 2030. And that was a moment where the citizens could actually evaluate and give their feedback, and they gave a very bad grade to government in that sense. So, you know, so basically what's been done before at the national level has been actually quite path-breaking and bold. And the question is the Conference for Europe going to be a regression compared to those things? Or is it going to be a continuation and a building on the lessons that we've actually learned in these previous experiences? And I can see that there's an effort to learn, actually. So I see very clearly in the design, the part of it that I understand, an effort to build on the Irish case, on the French Great National Debate and Convention for Climate. It's just that, yeah, I still have so many questions that I can't really say for sure whether it meets the standard of an open democracy. My sense is that it's currently, you know, still quite below my bar, but again, my bar is probably too high for this kind of experiment at this stage. I think it's going to take a long time for European bureaucracies and elites to really infuse the spirit of participatory democracy and deliberative democracy. I think it really requires a shift of mindset that I don't know that everyone is capable of doing at a certain point in their career. I think what changes people's minds is seeing things and experiencing them from within. So the hope is that even if it's not an ideal process, that enough people will be involved in it to be changed by it. And by people, I mean not so much the citizens, which I'm sure will measure up. I have no worries about that. But it's more the organizers themselves, which may see that their fears about allowing for a deliberative space online, for example, are not justified. The fear that, you know, if we talk about antagonizing topics, difficult topics, like say immigration, actually people say very sensible things in context where, you know, there's like a structure and a design, not talking about, you know, YouTube comment section, of course. And so that I think it might expand the realm of the possible for future years. And I think this hopefully is only a beginning.
Thank you, Hélène. I need to stop you here. Thank you for providing.
I'll end on this hopeful note, and I really look forward.
Exactly. Thank you for providing such an exhaustive analysis of the participatory nature of this exercise, which of course is work in progress. But as you said, it comes a bit late, and the participatory paradigm embraced by the Union might be the old one. Is look for a validation as opposed to.
It's all about validation.
Right. Let me turn now to Professor Guérot. Ulrike, you have been theorizing and advocating for a European Republic for years now, and your ideas are finding their ways in mainstream politics, at least in Germany, where the rising Greens have been embracing your Republican ideas. To what extent do you think this conference on the future of Europe, as we are discussing it today, could potentially be a milestone, or at least a contributing factor to the realization of your vision for a European Republic? Ulrike.
First, I'm very thankful to be here. I mean, I remember that I was with Giuliano Amato so many times in Rome when we discussed the banking crisis. Amato, you remember the times of 2011 and 2012, and it's important to keep in mind sort of where do we come from and what happened by then and what is happening now. Alberto, we share so many thoughts and actions on Europe, so it's really a sort of family meeting here. I have prepared 5 points. The first is that I totally want to underscore what Hélène Landmore just has said. The subject of the European citizen comes in very lately into 70 years of European integration. Yeah? We are basically realizing that citizens matter and that citizens' wishes and positions matter and that the citizens are basically the sovereign of each and every system. And so it's very important to realize, when did this happen? And I think it's fair to say that it happened basically the crisis ago, 10 years, the banking crisis, when we were so much shaken in the system with austerity policies and populism and finger pointing, the Greeks and the Italians and so on and so forth, that the first upraisal as European citizens happened by then. We saw European alternatives, we saw Indignatius, we saw Stefan Essel, and for the first time there was something like a realization of European citizens all together, especially the youngsters, who would say, we want Europe, but not this EU. We want to be as citizens represented. We want to have social rights. We do not want this banking union, and so on and so forth. Yeah? So it's very important to detect today that if through the pandemic we are now going for a conference on the future of Europe, that this momentum, the citizens are there, the NGOs are there, the European activism of citizens is there, that with the pandemic, the EU system could no longer bypass this. Yeah? And I think it's very important to note that Mrs. von der Leyen herself, who has realized that she wasn't a Spitzenkandidat and still became president of the Commission, basically is the symbol of the democratic deficit. And that is because she realized this, she said in her inaugurational speech, Now the citizens must be listened. Yeah, and I think this is a momentum of 10 years. I would underscore, Helene, it comes too late, but finally it is there. And whoever has been out in the last days on Twitter, whatever, 9th of May, has been seen floodings of citizens conference, and the platform is there, and motivation and mobilization. So this is my first point. Okay, I come to my second point. The citizens are now there, but it's also important to realize that we are not doing this for the first time. We did have the conference and the Laken process and the constitutional process in 2001, 2, 3. Everybody who is academic, be reminded, we were very, very far. We had discussions on fiscal federalism. Jean-Marc Ferry wrote a fantastic book about l'État, la question de l'État européen. We dared to speak about the European state in 2003, yeah, before the whole process failed. So we were very far with the Giscard sort of constitutional process. We all know why it failed in 2005 and 2005 in France and in the Netherlands, but we were very far. And then, not to forget, we had the EU Commission-induced citizens dialogues. Some of you may remind Frank Biancheri, who by then already, 10 years ago, 12 years ago, organized the Running for Europe. Yeah? So it was the second momentum to raise the citizen question. And Samantha Besson, a very, very stunning French academic, wrote her breathtaking article in 2008 that union citizenship, which is the market citizenship granted to all European citizens, turned to European citizenship in 2008. So all this is a decade ago. And I think we have now, with this conference on the future of Europe, distinguished different features to succeed it in difference to 2008 and to 2003. Why? Because we have pushed forward the definition of what European citizenship is. And this is very important to me, because we went from union citizenship in the Maastricht Treaty, Article 1 to 12, to a European citizenship. We are now addressed as European citizens. So we took space of Article 22, Treaty of the European Union, which gives us a European citizenship which is evolutionary and dynamic, and it's very important. It's very important to realize that we dare to pronounce the wording of European citizens, because in essence, we are not European citizens. We are French and Slovenian and Hungarian and Italian, but we are addressed as European citizens. Like Macron, when he wrote the open letter, he wrote citoyens européens et européennes. It's very important that we succeeded this semantic shift, that we think we are European citizens. So why is this important? And now I come back to what Amato said, and that is my third point. I do detect that we have a complete shift in the way we run European discussions. If in the 80s and 90s we had large discussions about Bundesstaat, Staatenbund, federation, and so on and so forth, and we talked about European integration, the integration of states, and that's what the Council must do, and the Council must integrate, and then they need treaty change, blah, blah, blah. Now we talk no longer about European integration, because integration is finished. We basically have a totally integrated single market, and we do have an integrated currency, which is our single currency. But what we discuss today is European democracy. And if we talk about European democracy, it's no longer the states who are the actors, but it's the citizens who are the actors. And this is why we are now in this process of participatory democracy, listening to the citizens and so on and so forth. And it's very important to understand this. The states are no longer the actors, the citizens are the actors. So one single point on this point 3, if citizens want to be the actors in a democracy, it is overarching important that the citizens of this democracy, the European democracy, are equal in front of the law. Legal equality of citizens is the necessary, though not sufficient condition for each and every democracy. To make a long story short, in the 80s, we succeeded legal equality for goods. This is the single market. Then we said in the 90s, because we have legal equality for goods, we want a single market, and that was the euro. So the process we are in as contemporaries, in my opinion, if we say the citizens are the actors, we want European democracy, and the actors, the citizens, need to be equal in front of the law, is that we need to achieve legal equality of all European citizens in all civic, social belongings, in all what makes us citizenship, right? For me, this is a breathtaking paradigm change. And because this is so, the framing of Amato, this sort of, if the states do this and then they need treaty change and then there will a negative referendum, for me, honestly, it's no longer the question. If you can't get a thing through the way you think you need to get it through, and you don't get it, the treaty change by the states, you pass the whole thing to the citizens as actors, and you have different and open ways of getting what you want and what you need. This is why legal equality for citizens, I recommend the book of Pierre-Rosan Valland, Le Sacre du Citoyen. We think we are European citizens, but we are only European citizens in what is consumer protection, roaming fees. We are only European citizens, so market citizenship. We are only European citizens because, like, as a Dane, you can go in whatever Rwanda to a German consulate. So we have some specific rights, but we are not European citizens in everything that Pierre-Rosan Valland calls le sacre du citoyen, which is voting, taxation, and access to the social. So
Ulrike, can I stop you for a second? Because Professor Amato will soon be leaving us because he has a hearing this morning. Should we ask Professor Amato if he has something to counter to you as a possible response also to the other points that were made by other speaker, Professor?
Yeah, I only have a few seconds, Ulrike. No, I don't see a difference between the two of us on this point. I simply said, Ulrike, that I wouldn't start a discussion on whatever issue from the angle, should we modify the treaties or not?
Yeah.
Because this is a divisive issue that remains abstract. I would say, is this necessary to make us equal? Taking your basic example. And do we agree in wanting all of us equal under this score? Wonderful. This is the decision of the citizens. Changing the treaties is implementing this decision. This was my only point. So we are still on the same side, Ulrike. And I have to apologize. I said it already. Now it's for me the moment to leave. It's really a pity because it's a very beautiful discussion, but I have to go.
Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Super, George, super. Thank you for agreeing on this point. I think there's no dichotomy between us. It's just like, for me, it's important that we go through this gate, this utmost political gate, with the semantics of European citizenship, because we avoid the polarization of discussion, And if we frame it like European citizens need to be equal in front of the law, we can spare out all these nasty discussions of the past about Bundesstaat, Staatenbund, federating, and blah, 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 which are so polarizing in the council and everything you have experienced. So, but I'm very happy that we agree, and I come to Italy and to Rome soon again, Amato. Is
okay.
the promise?
See you.
See you. So I just can continue my fifth point, 2 minutes. Yeah.
2 points to go. Yes, Ulrike, 2 points to go.
2 points to go. But basically, the fourth point was this legal equality. The first was we have the citizens are the forgotten subjects. The second was the comparison 2003, 2008, 2000, and today. The third point was who's the actor, state or citizens. And the fourth was if the citizens want to be the actor, they must be equal in front of the law. So 4. 5 is just some concerns about the conference. And then I go with Helena again. I think there is a fundamental point about the question, who's the sovereign? To just put some vinegar into the wine for a second, I think everybody's happy about the conference. Everybody's happy about the energy. Everybody is happy that something is going and many people are listening. And still there's a question, who will be consulted, who's in, is it only a bubble, what's the methods? All this is totally complicated, I totally agree. But the more fundamental question is, about the wording of consultation, because as a political scientist, I say citizens are not consulted, citizens decide. Yeah, citizens are the sovereign. And so basically the current European Parliament is the representation of the citizens. In a way, a parliament is a citizen consultation, right? A representative format to represent citizens for consultation. This is basically what a parliament is, yeah? So if now we have the need to do a citizen consultation, then obviously because something in the representative schemes of our systems are wrong. Because if not, we would say the parliament is there, the parliament represents us, so we are the citizens represented by the parliament decides, yeah? So what we do have, and not only on the European level, but also on many other national levels, is that we have a crisis of representation. And because we do no longer feel represented by our parliaments, local, regional, national, European parliaments, we create these discursive schemes. In essence, I'm not against, I'm just not against. Yeah, every discussion on Europe is a good discussion on Europe. But my fundamental problem is, for a hypothetical second, if the conference should come up with things that the European Parliament should not want, I think it will not happen. Yeah, but for a hypothetical second, who are the citizens? Those who are represented through the Parliament, or those who are consulted directly? Yeah, so there is an inherent sort of problem with this consultation, and at some point we need to get some political science awareness about this. It will not happen. I think there's no dichotomy. The European Parliament is a driver of the process, and the Commission is too, so the real problem is the Council. We all know this, yeah? But just hypothetically, what we are doing is we are playing a discursive participatory scheme of direct democracy against the parliamentary system, and there is tension. That's the only thing I want to say. And the last word, Alberto, is, again with Helene, I'm so happy to agree with you so much. I'm all in favor of the sort of experiment we are doing, yeah? And it's a good experiment, and we are happy that, you know, in the United States, in China, nobody would do such an experiment. We should be really proud of this experiment that we are doing. But we need to have a substantial expectation management, because creating lots of expectation and then whatever the report will be is filed into the trash basket, like the Constitution was filed into the trash basket in 2003, will utmost disappoint all those who are in this process and spend hours and hours and hours, like me, like you, Alberto, like all us together in the process. It will disappoint us awkwardly, yeah? So expectation management is key. And the second is, we should not allow, and I'm very serious about this, we should not allow that consultation becomes a substitute for real change. Yeah? Sort of the argument, we consulted you, and that is sort of end of participatory democracy, we have a report, cannot be the end of this conference. We need to make sure that at the end, there is substantial systemic change in the system. However we call this, I do not only say treaty change or whatever, but substantial systemic change, because the success story of Europe, the market and the currency, were nothing else than substantial systemic change in favor of Europe. And I want substantial systemic change in favor of the European citizens, and then, and only then, the conference for me will be a success. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ricky, for sharing so much. I'm sure on the point of the tension between representative and participatory democracy, Helen will have a lot to say. But before that, let me turn to Ms. Dr. Nguyen too. As an academic and think tanker focusing on the European political space, what can realistically be expected from the conference on the future of Europe? Looking a bit at the end, of course, there are a lot of caveats, a lot of methodological questions up in the air, but what is your expectation? What is your sense of it?
Thank you, Alberto, and thank you for to the organizers for having me here in this very interesting debate. And in fact, I am one of the skeptics that I think you have mentioned in the beginning. I'm actually very skeptical of what can come out of this conference, both in the way that it has been designed, but also in the way that it has been marketed by the European institutions. I think we've all had a look at this website or this platform where the motto is "the future is in your hands." On Twitter, the hashtag is "the future is yours." And I'm simply not quite sure whether the way that the conference is designed currently, that this is what it will be, that it will be in fact the place where the future of Europe or the future of the European Union will be decided, can be decided. And this is of course criticism that has come up a lot in the debate. I don't think I am the only one to voice these criticisms. I'm perhaps a tad more pessimistic than other commentators when it comes to what can come out of the conference, because there are of course a lot of obstacles that stand in the way, I think, of what can be the result of this exercise. And I will just mention a few. One is, of course, that it is very short. It was supposed to be a 2-year process. We all know that. And this is, I think, simply a time frame that would be needed if we were to have really substantial discussions on where is Europe headed. It is now, due to different circumstances between the pandemic and these interinstitutional fightings and everything, it is now about a year long. All the while it is still very unlikely that there will be really meetings in person possible. So now we have a very short time frame during which probably virtual formats will still be the norm more than the exception. So the question is how much of a very in-depth discussion among transnational citizens panels and among different citizens can really be done in this short time frame. Secondly, of course, the governance structures are very top heavy. We have now this 3-pronged joint presidency because the institutions could not decide who would take the lead. It was a lot of fighting. The presidency works alongside a 9-member strong executive board, which decides by unanimity, which really is the modus operandi that ensures that either things really slow down or are reduced to the lowest common denominator. So it's not really a sort of decision-making process that has a lot of potential for moving forward, as we have seen over and over again in also different parts of decision-making processes in the EU. And that leads me to my third point. I think that probably the biggest issue of the conference is that it seems to lack support by the member states. And I think this is something that Professor Amato has also mentioned. And if we have seen anything in the European Union also in the past year, is that it is very difficult to move forward any kind of policy or any kind of changes if member states are not behind it, or if the member states are very want to veto it. Let's put it that way. And we already have 12 member states that have now declared not to want to be bound or legally bound by whatever comes out of conference. So I'm not very optimistic that the way it has been set up and the way that member states have sort of been talking about it, that there's a lot of potential for real changes to be implemented afterwards. So this is something, a promise of bringing EU democracy closer to the people, closer to the citizens, is of course a very nice one. It's a very, very great idea, and I don't want to negate that. And I do think that we should sort of try to do the best that we can with the conference, get engaged as we can with the conference, but without a clear backing of the governments, I am afraid that it might amount to little more than just an empty promise, which sort of leads me to my second overall point. I am afraid that with all of the expectations raised, and you have mentioned this also, Alberto, in the beginning, and with all of this fanfare and this, the future is yours, the future is in your hands declarations, but without a clear follow-up plan, which apparently does not exist so far, the conference might do more harm than good. Because it was designed to make up for the disappointment that was the Spitzenkandidaten procedure in 2019, which Ulrike mentioned. It ironically seems to risk become sort of the same thing. So this promise of having a more democratic European Union, a European Union closer to the citizens, raising very high expectations that in the end risk becoming, well, not fulfilled, and risk becoming dashed by interinstitutional fighting and national power grabs. So I am afraid that it would go along the very same lines of the Spitzenkandidaten procedure, which it's supposed to sort of counter really. So I think that we really should try to avoid that, to put too much expectations in the conference. And this is also something that has been said over and over again, and then the institutions go and say, well, the future is in your hands and the future is yours with the conference. And I think what we also should avoid with this message is giving the impression that it is only now that suddenly the future is in the citizens' hand, that only now they have a say in where Europe is headed, because I find that the message somehow implies that this was never the case in the EU, that citizens perhaps before not quite had a say in the future, which is of course not true, because we do have the democratic institutional structures that exist. We do have the national parliamentary elections, we have the European parliamentary elections. It's not always as direct as we perhaps would want it to be, and there are of course a lot of shortcomings in the Spitzenkandidaten procedure, as it happened last elections is one of the example. But this messaging of it is only now that the future is in your hands, I find it also problematic in terms of the overall structure of the European Union, how democracy in the European Union is communicated. So I want to keep this short. I think in the best case scenario, so in terms of your question, what can we realistically expect of the conference? I think in the best case scenario, there will be, well, agreements. In the plenary, there will be agreements on substantive issues, on where we want to be headed in certain policy areas, and these will be taken up by the European institutions in one way or another. I think in the worst case scenario, the conference will turn out to be very little more than just an empty promise, and one that might do more damage to European democracy than it would do good. But I think here it also really much depends, of course, how the next year will go and how much citizens will mobilize and how willing member states will be to move into the same directions as the outcomes of the conference.
Thank you too for your analysis and for your two scenarios at the two ends of a spectrum of possibilities. Let me perhaps turn back to Hélène on the big question raised by Ulrike. What if citizens and their representatives, because of the participatory space, disagree? Who is the sovereign, Hélène?
That's an excellent question. So I totally agree with Tuningian's diagnosis of a crisis of representation. And that's also what Ulrike Guérot said. That's, I think, what we're trying to fix with these participatory processes. So clearly, it's not that only the parliament or only elected officials that have all the legitimacy and sovereignty. We try to sort of like, find a way for a smaller subset of us to make decisions on our behalf with all the legitimacy they could. And we're reaching the limit of that model in some respects for me, because we see that they're not making the decisions that the rest of us think are good. So we are trying a new path, which is, okay, let's go back to the people themselves. Except that we're never going back to the people themselves. That's an illusion, the illusion of direct democracy. There's no way you can write a treatise or even amendments to a treatise through direct democracy procedures. It will never get to the level of deliberative quality you need to produce legitimate changes. So we're back to the question then, if we have to select a subset, who is it going to be, and how many of them do we need, and how do they need to make proposals and decisions and relate to the rest of the population? So my view is that probably we made a mistake in the 18th century in thinking that elected groups were the best representatives or the best or the most democratic representatives, and that we'd be better off with a randomly selected sample, the way the classical Athens had. They had a council of 500 setting the agenda for their polity. And so my view is that there should be at some point, if we ever reform the treatises and go through new forms of constitutional reforms, create a house of the people with maybe 400 randomly selected citizens from all over Europe. And then you'd get, I think, a very different legislation coming out of that body. But that takes us way beyond the realm of what's feasible for now. I think, we're talking 50 years from now, maybe. So right now, who should have the final say and who should decide? I think it should be a collaboration and a co-construction between the existing institutions and these participatory, experiments that bring in new voices that are very much needed, but also suffer from a certain lack of legitimacy. When you have people on a website, what kind of legitimacy do they have? Even 100 people on a panel, what legitimacy do they have? I resist the claim that all the legitimacy is there. I think legitimacy is something you build, something you gain by proving that what you say and do is right, by showing that this is an open democratic process. So I think if we continue pitting debate as a tension between the legitimacy of elected representatives and the legitimacy of these citizens who show up in these participatory processes, which for many of them, I would call them democratic representatives of a non-electoral kind. We're not going to go anywhere. So my model is more like the Irish Citizens Assembly of 2012, when they decided to have a hybrid model where you had 2/3 citizens, 1/3 politicians, because this was theoretically very impure and complicated to understand, like what's the legitimacy, that arises from this mixed body. But it built trust between the two constituencies, the ordinary citizens and the extraordinary citizens, if you will, that elected elites are. And then going forward, they were able to work with a pure randomly selected citizen, the one from 2016, which worked on, among other things, the decriminalization of abortion. And Parliament was behind them, supporting them, so that when the referendum time came, all the legitimacy sort of aligned behind one idea, which was the decriminalization of abortion. In France, it was much more complicated because the birth of the convention was basically the will of President Macron. And because we have such a presidential system and regime, Parliament felt like it was sort of short-circuited or bypassed. That giving this convention of 150 randomly selected citizens the power to initiate law, pretty much, was like an insult, adding to the injury of the fact that Parliament is pretty powerless in France. So then you had all these tensions, and the current result is that the uptake by Parliament of the proposals by the convention is rather limited and frustrating and all that. And it's very unlikely on top of that the Senate is going to authorize any kind of referendum on, for example, the modifications of the constitution recommended by the Citizens Convention. So what's the lesson in all this? I think that there's got to be co-construction, cooperation upstream of the process. And here again, I wonder, is this taken into account in the design? Will citizens on the panels have a chance to meet with members of the European Parliament? Will there be some kind of common goal that they all work towards and they try to educate each other about? I don't know. I think was just said before, the design doesn't give us hope that there's much impact planned for this conference. And if there's no impact, then what's the point for governments to invest themselves in that sort of thing, to build their, to bet their credibility on it? And what's the point for citizens themselves? Like, why should they invest time and energy in something that's going to lead to one more report that no one's going to read? So that's—
Thank you, Hélène. A quick reaction from Ulrike, and then we take a few questions coming from the chat.
I only have one reaction, which is, you said probably we did it wrong in the 18th century when we created parliaments or so. No, we did it on purpose. It's very important to understand that when we made out of subject citizens in the 1789 process, representative democracy was installed to basically keep the people or the mob or the whatever out. Yeah, I mean, it was a meritocratic structure to keep the elites still governing the system. I mean, this is basically state of the art of political science research today. So the interesting thing today is whether all this digitalization and the very fact that citizens now can speak out at every given occasion will change that device.
Hélène.
No, just quick point. I don't disagree. I think there was an ideological sort of interests, that led to that. But I also think I wouldn't underestimate the importance of theoretical constructs and ideas, and some of them were wrong. For example, I'm convinced that until very recently, we really thought that in order to have a smart group of competent people doing good law, you needed to staff the assembly with the best and smartest and most virtuous people you could find, right? And it turns out that might not even be the right model, that you need to have— it's much more important to diversify your pool than to groom each person for competence on an individual level. And that's a paradigm shift that if only our elites understood it, they would realize, oh, I'm great as an individual. It's just that wouldn't be insulting. It's just that as a group, we're too similar. We have blind spots. We need to open up. We need to include people, including people who don't have the right accent, don't speak that well, don't know that much, because they bring in a ton of things that is currently lacking for good policymaking.
Agree.
We agree. Fantastic. To Michal, for a few questions, I think Oliver is ready with the first one.
Thank you very much. As we are running out of time, we will be very quick. So we'll start with Oliver's questions, and then I will read the three questions from our audience, and then I will give the floor to the three speakers, and if they could refer to these questions, it would really be great. So Oliver, who is Oliver Garner, who is one of our editors, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Michal, and thank you to all the panelists for a really enlightening discussion. In a recent monograph, Federico Fabbrini has argued that the precedent of the Eurozone crisis measures should be used with the outcome of the conference on the future of Europe, and he proposes the creation of a political compact, so the use of international law and inter se agreement between all or maybe only some of the member states. Do the panelists believe that the creation of a new international treaty rather than amendment of the pre-existing treaties would be a desirable outcome and perhaps would provide the opportunity for a fresh start? Or perhaps, building upon the discussion that's been had on the sovereign, would it be better for such a political compact to come out of an autonomous exercise by an institution such as the European Parliament? Thank you very much.
And now let me read the three questions that our audience posed. The first one is, what if the people wanted less Europe in some areas? Should it be translated, and how should it be translated if that's the case? Is it possible that the result of the conference is less Europe in some important areas and not more Europe? The second question would be how to, if such an exercise is possible without a European public sphere. I guess that we all agree that there is a problem with this European public sphere, and the important question is if we can think of exercise like that without this public sphere. And third question is maybe more theoretical. Why it's not the case anymore that the parliaments represent people? Should this part of democracy, shouldn't this part of democracy be reformed so that the parliaments could constantly like reform our democracies, and we wouldn't have to organize every 20 years this kind of failed or not failed conferences or conventions. So now, if you don't mind, I would give the floor to the three speakers, and then we could wrap up with Alberto. So maybe Thu, I don't know if you could start.
If I may, I'd like to go first because I need to be out at 11:30 in theory. I go very quick, starting by the last question. Why do parliaments no longer represent? Because the elections are bought. I mean, because elections are bought. I mean, because the perversive features look to the United States. You can only run for presidential elections if you are millionaire, billiardaire, whatever. I mean, Cambridge Analytica, the digitalization, the Brexit was basically influenced by bots attacks. We all know this. It's bought by Russian, whatever media streams. I mean, elections are really fragile exercises today. Yeah, with all the digitalization can be bought. So is those who are elected represent the people? Question mark. The public sphere. My answer is we are creating it. We are creating it here and now. We are in a Zoom. I did in my self-perception 1 million Zooms last week. I think everybody did 1 million Zooms last week. So we are in the process of creating this public sphere. And if we talk serious things, the public sphere will come. Publicity follows where the action is. So if there's action in the conference, the public will go there. The second question was less or more Europe. For me, it's a totally wrong framing, because what is less, what is more? I mean, this is yesterday's discussion. The real question is, what do we do structurally on a European level? And I would also contest that those who say that they are against the EU and the governance and whatever, that they are against Europe. Even Marine Le Pen is today for the euro. Many people of the Peace Party and Fidesz underscore that they are not against Europe, but against some features and dysfunctional flaws of the EU system. So the problem is not less and more Europe. The problem is really how to fix Europe so that we build a system that is working for everybody. And for that, I think even those who are pretendedly against the EU today are not necessarily for less Europe. Yeah, so wrong framing. And the compact question, my answer to what should be the outcome, it's very evident. It's no longer constitutional change and referenda, constitutional change and ratification and all this business we have been doing for 20 years with Irish no, Irish yes, French no, whatever. Yeah. So we are 446 million European citizens on this continent. Let's take the Scots in. And what we are doing is we write a European constitution, and this constitution is voting through public referenda by all Europeans, European-wide, on one single day. And that is the sovereign process of the European citizens giving themselves in an emancipatory process a European constitution. That's the only outcome I can see at the end of this future conference.
Thank you very much. Now I would give the floor to Tu.
Thank you, Michel. I would perhaps start with the question of the political compact, like the fiscal compact. I think this is a question that must be asked after the conference, in fact, because of course the fiscal compact served a very specific purpose, and it was a very specific reason why it was taken outside of the treaties, because the goal could not be reached within the treaties due to the resistance of some member states. So whether or not we need a political compact after the conference sort of depends on what comes out of the conference. If it is outcomes that don't need a treaty revision that can be done inside the treaties, well, then we don't need to go outside of the treaties. And then if it requires a treaty amendment, that is then the question if it is desirable to go outside of treaties again. But I think this is a question that sort of preempts well, what to say about it. I think that really depends. About the European public sphere, here I totally agree with Ulrike. I mean, I'm very skeptical of the conference, but I think what it does perhaps can do is to create a public sphere and to create a space where citizens debate and where citizens across different member states discuss the same issues. And I think this is perhaps one of the biggest advantages of the conference, even if nothing comes out of it, that I don't know. And then on the question on less Europe or more Europe, well, I'd say if the idea is to give citizens a say, of course, less Europe is also a say. It's also, if the wish is to have less competences pooled on European level or to have less cooperation between the member states, if we are serious about saying we want to listen to what the citizens want, I think we cannot only go the way that we want it to go and only follow up where it is pro-European and for more European cooperation, but it needs to go both ways, of course. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So now I would give the floor to Ellen.
Well, I largely agree with both speakers, so I'll just reiterate some points. Public sphere, it's a chicken and egg regress. I mean, we would never get a public sphere until we start organizing such debates, and then we hope that the ecology that supports this public sphere, including the media in particular, learn to talk about multilingual events that are, you know, taking place in sort of like in ways that are hard to cover for people who are used to covering national election-centric, you know, campaigns and things like that. So yeah, it's a bet, and you have to start somewhere. So why not start there? I think it's fine. But I also think the imaginary is very important, and I wish we talked more also about, you know, the arts, movies, just all these things that build a common European imaginary. And when I look at the you know, the currency, the money, like all these buildings empty, you know, no people, and it's not really inspiring. So even that was kind of like a big failure in my view. So why don't we have a conversation about, okay, how do we redesign the, you know, the banknotes and just work on the symbols? Why don't we have a competition about, you know, what if we were serious about thinking of a revision of treatises and a creation of a house of the people, what does the architecture of a house like that look like? Can we be bold and utopian and visionary and imagine something that's like, you know, organic, conducive to conversations? Because, for example, I always thought that the Jena Palace, where the Citizens Convention for Climate took place, was way too monumental and you know, loud. I mean, it was not conducive to good conversation. There were all kinds of problems. So why don't we do that? Like launch a big competition. The Eurovision is a big success in creating a sort of European identity around really bad music. Why not? So I think that's where I would bet also that we can create something common and inspiring and unique. What about those who want less Europe? Totally agree with Sue. We're not going to start this by saying, oh, well, no, it's just about more Europe of a better kind. No, I don't think we can prejudge of the conclusion there. And I suspect, like Ulrike, that many people who want less Europe are just in fact, want less of a certain kind of Europe. And if we give them a real choice of a different kind of Europe where they're listened to and they have other options, that would be fine for them. But there's I think an irreducible number of people who actually do not want to be part of these mega entities where democracy is actually vanishingly sort of practicable. And so I would take that very seriously, actually. I stop here.
Thank you very much. When it comes to the architecture, it seems that now the Commission started to think about it. That there is this idea of a new European Bauhaus, but we'll see where
would it be?
Bring us. So now I'll give back the floor to Alberto, who's not only among many other roles is also our section head on the future of Europe, and we hope to continue with Alberto and with these debates. So Alberto, I give you back.
Thank you, Michael. I'm going to let you go very soon. We have heard different analysis, different expectation in relation to the Conference on the Future of Europe, but we all seem to agree that this conference carries some novelty. There's an experimental nature in it, which is very well embedded, at least in terms of purpose, not necessarily in terms of design. The jury is still out. We just started. We seems worth it to give it a chance, despite some reticence among the observers, because at the end of the day, it might disrupt the status quo. And the status quo is very unsatisfactory. And COVID certainly has been an accelerator in highlighting the incomplete nature of the European Union as it stands today. Please join me in thanking our speakers for being with us today. See you on this channel for more conversation on Europe, democratic future. And many thanks to the new Review of Democracy for bringing us together, for fostering this conversation, and to the CEU Institute of Democracy for hosting us. Wish all the editors of the RevDem the best of success in unpacking new and old democratic dynamics which are occurring within, across Europe and beyond. This is our hope, as you might read in the recent publication which put forward the objective, the ideas, the values that really animate the Review of Democracy. Thank you again for being with us, and talk to you very soon.